So let me ask you, how often do you think about a city as a centralized unit? We often think of great cities like New York, LA, San Francisco, or Chicago, but have you thought much about the design of a city and how it came to be as it is today? On this episode, Chris Maker supports our escape from the cave as we discuss urban design and ways in which we might design the city for optimal human connection. Chris is an observational architect and urban designer. Before I jump into it, I'd really appreciate it if you could go check me out on Patreon and consider donating. There are some really cool rewards for donating, and I'll be coming up with some new ones soon. However, if you're not into doing that kind of thing, then I'd also be extremely grateful if you could go leave a review or a comment. And finally, let's take our sixth step out of the cave with Chris Maker. Alrighty, so usually start out by kind of giving you the lead-in to give the frame for the conversation. Okay. Because this part is actually pretty challenging for people to talk in the way we're about to talk. Because we're not talking necessarily about how we fix, Phoenix or this society that we're in right now. We're imagining, right, that we're going to build it from scratch, and we can really build it however we want. So really the only problems are, like materials to use and how things will be set up and the systems we can use and like human interactions and things like that. So, for right now, let's imagine that we got an island and our goal is to create an optimized society fresh from the start. And we can build that really however we want with the knowledge we have now, or testing we can do if we'd like to do that. And right at the moment, we're going to say that we have nothing built. We can build all the buildings, all the urban design from scratch, and that we want to focus on a pleasing and meaningful aesthetic, right? Functionality and sustainability. So using materials and design that works for us humans, right? But also nature and not impeding too much on that. So we're not creating as much waste as we would in the current society we live in. So given your experience and your background, how would you go about doing that? How could we possibly make that happen?
It's like a $10 million question. It's like this kind of question that's, I guess everybody wants to sort of grapple with, but nobody really knows how to kind of deal with. It's like a philosophical question, right? Yeah. It's like the a priori kind of idea of what if, there's a blank slate, and there's probably never going to be a blank slate because we are we always come with this baggage that we as humans kind of carry with us in any sort of interaction, and that has to deal with generally, a few things: our economic systems, our transportation systems, and our sort of political systems. Those three kind of, and there's a myriad of others, but those three things kind of dictate much of how we sort of interact with our environment. And
right, and I guess that's what I need to preface with a little bit more. I'm still working out this intro a little bit and the framing of it. That's all going to be, what this podcast is examining, is how to start from scratch with all that stuff, right? So you can build it like that. And we don't have to, we're just playing with the idea right now. So just kind of imagine that it is possible, right? And go from there. And you're welcome to talk about the challenges, which I think we will go into later on as well. Because we do have to be aware of we're going to run into these problems too with building this, right?
Yeah, so, what we kind of, as a planner or as an urban designer, we kind of look towards, models in the past, because that's all we really know, and then we kind of try to extrapolate how something could, function in the future from, looking at the past. And that's kind of what I mean about looking at, historical models of, what we are sort of familiar with. So that being said, we, in the past, 100, 150 years, we have gone through, like 3 or 4, kind of paradigm shifts of how the city can either function and how it cannot function. Turn of the century, people thought that, the city, back in, early 1900s, late, 1800s, people thought the city was overcramped and crowded, and tenement buildings and high density, places like New York, places like Boston, and there was a big push, for the sanitation of cities. So like people like Upton Sinclair wrote books like The Jungle, and people are trying to clean up the city and create sort of regulatory mechanisms like zoning codes that would basically allow for that, the segregation of industry from housing and those types of things. And, we've almost come full circle at this point. Now we want to see that. We want to see, density. We want to see people in spaces. And so the idea is that, back then, we didn't understand some of the things that we're looking at now. Back then, people were crowded into spaces, and it was like kind of this idea of sorted conditions, and people kind of didn't really live in, ideal situations, but they were, living in cities that were, in many respects today, would be viewed as like somehow like European. People like maybe went 5 miles at the most each and every day. They never traveled 20, 30 miles for commutes, and they basically had this very compact footprint, which is very desirable today. It is kind of the reverse, but architects and planners at that point were kind of arguing to sort of make those situations less dense and to remove people from those situations, and but there were really good reasons for that.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask. Like, what are some of the arguments that can be made for like a more dense city or like a less dense city?
Yeah, so I'm getting in this kind of arcing kind of discussion to where we are today, and that's partly because of the jobs and the sort of systems and the movement of people has completely changed. People now don't need to rely on jobs which are a half mile away. They can get in their car and drive themselves to a job that's 15, 20 miles away, and sit in a commute which is 45 minutes long. So that's something so they can choose to live in far reaching suburbs, right? Which is something that we're kind of struggling and grappling with as a society and cities, because we don't know how to deal with the disconnect now between jobs and where you live. That's a big complaint, but it hasn't always been that way. Right. And that's a particularly, American thing too. I think if you look at some of the European cities, a lot of them don't have those same kind of extreme examples of people living in situations like that. So I think the job work thing is a big thing, and that whole model has really shifted. Now we're like, instead of trying to remove ourselves from where we work, and again, why were they doing that? It was probably because they were working in factories, and factories that had to do with heavy, dirty environments, dangerous environments that would put people at risk. Right. So that would also be very polluting. Like that sort of idea of manufacturing and industry and those sort of that job base is kind of radically shifted from that era to some like a post-industrialist era. We're really not living in that era anymore. So those like shifts and the macro economy have given us a certain sense of freedom, but we haven't really dealt very well with that freedom. And the legacy of the planning and architecture and urban design from that era is still with us, and we are sort of slowly kind of getting back to what we would consider would be, a viable urban design, and we're like sort of having to relearn those lessons.
Interesting.
In the hardest of ways. Because we're really struggling with that. People are still choosing to sort of like live out in Goodyear and Glendale and Chandler at the expense of what many would conceive of as a sustainable, viable city. And that freedom has given us, a limited perspective in terms of how to, sort of work with our cities. Because if people continually choose through, their own to live out there, we lose a sort of compact, cohesive, and economic systems that would lend themselves to a better city living, sustainability, efficiency in transportation, efficiency in job growth, everything. It comes through like compact urban design, right? If you don't have to like extend like the utility system out to Goodyear, like you can maximize it within a 10-15 mile radius in Phoenix, and you don't have to
like maximum efficiency,
everything.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like if you like the other like a good example would be Paulo Solari's Arcology, if you're familiar with any of that.
No.
But it's just maximizing the efficiency of density and going in a vertical way. I mean, but it's an extreme example to
is New York a good example of that, or is that not such a good example of that? Yeah.
New York's a great example. Yeah, I mean, so New York is a terrific example of what a city could and should probably function like. There's a great book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, which, I mean, if you're not familiar with that, I think...
I'm not. Yeah, no, I'm sure. I'll gotta check all these out, yeah.
That's a great book of how, Jane Jacobs, argued against, what, at that point, it was like in the 60s that she wrote that book, 60s, whatever, about how modern city planning and zoning was kind of creating, bedroom communities that didn't really kind of address, the needs of city residents. And she said, there's a sort of organic process that happens through, grouping of people in, Greenwich Village at that point, and Soho, that had to do with, that couldn't be planned. You can't plan this sort of fine-grained mix of economics and, people coming together. You just can't plan it. That's like something that comes through like organically, naturally.
Don't you think you kind of can plan it, or I mean, doesn't it kind of happen when you kind of know someone's economic state, right? Couldn't you like kind of say like, because people like developers know that they're building like really expensive luxury apartments and things like that, and they know when they're building more like affordable housing. Like, isn't that kind of planning for that?
Yes and no. I think we've come to a certain point where, planners are now sort of reactive and not sort of progressive in many regards. Like, we sort of are reacting to the problems that we are facing now, but we could, like look at it in a whole different way and say, like, let's really do something that's going to bring a lot more benefits versus, looking at solving some of these problems. So then, that would be a different, viewpoint. Yeah, I mean, you could say, developers are going to...
But I guess that's what we're trying to get at with this podcast, right? Is we can think about it in a proactive way if we're starting from like scratch. Like, how might we do that? What might be the best way to develop maybe these zones or, develop different areas?